Thank you very much, Richard. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our conference. It's great to see so many of you here today. Those of you who have been to our conference before will be very familiar with the current situation. Environmental change and a range of human impacts are placing salmon at risk across their natural range. And the wild salmon crisis is now widely recognised. We're working to ensure that the Scottish Government and regulatory authorities do everything in their power to safeguard our wild salmon in those areas where they can make a difference. And this is the focus of our advocacy work. We're very conscious that the declines in Atlantic salmon and sea trout populations and the resulting impacts on fisheries are hitting some rivers very hard. We share the concerns of anglers, of gillies and fishery owners, and the concerns of our members about the current situation. This is a big issue, and we need to work together to make a difference. As you all know, salmon face a wide range of issues, and there is no one single reason for the declines that we're facing. This slide focuses on in-river and coastal pressures, but it's important to emphasise that climate change has wide-ranging effects on salmon at the high seas as well. And the vast majority of the pressures that are identified on this slide are not under the direct control of fisheries managers. In fact, I'll highlight two of them, and those relate to exploitation, both illegal and legal within the fisheries itself, within rivers. They're under the control of fisheries managers, but the majority of the rest of these pressures are not. And that's why we need to work with government, with regulators, and a range of industries to address all of these important issues. So Aitchi Branding is speaking next, and she's going to talk about the Scottish Wild Salmon Strategy. So I'm not going to say too much here. But just to say that the strategy was published in January this year, and it's a high-level strategy to be followed by an implementation plan. And we welcome the completion of the first phase of this process, and we urge the Scottish Government to deliver the strategy without delay. It's great to see clear recognition of the issues that our wild salmon face, and the strategy commits to a range of actions which will be delivered through the implementation plan. Yesterday, I attended the National Economic Forum, where Scotland's national strategy for economic transformation was discussed. And the First Minister and the Finance Secretary were at pains to emphasise the critical importance of delivery. And exactly the same goes for the wild salmon strategy. Unless it is delivered at pace, it's simply just another document gathering dust on a shelf. And in terms of delivery, I'm really looking forward to learning from Robert Lennox about strategies to restore Atlantic salmon restoration. I'm sure there's a lot we can learn in terms of the implementation plan. But as always, resourcing this programme of work is a key consideration. And the need to resource this strategy is absolutely vital. And Dieter Helm later on will discuss some of the means that we might be able to resource this sort of action at a catchment scale. So as you'll be aware, Fisheries Management Scotland and the Rivers Trust joined the Missing Salmon Alliance in January 2021, and we talked about that at the conference last year. And we've seen real benefit in joining the Alliance. The collaborative working that we're doing between the members of the Alliance is really important, and we're working much more closely on specific policy areas and on communications and advocacy. And the Alliance is delivering great science and pulling these threads together through the Likely Suspects framework. And this approach allowed us to take Salmon School to COP26 in Glasgow, something that none of the members of the Alliance could have done in isolation. So as far as Salmon School is concerned, we worked with the renowned artist Joe Rosano, who's in the middle of the picture there in the checked shirt, to install Salmon School, 350 hand-blown glass salmon in the blue zone at COP26. And this provided a focal point for discussing the vital actions required to save our salmon, with delegates from across the UK and the wider salmon world. And Pedro Langdale and Robbie Douglas Miller, who are here in the conference at the conference today and also in this picture here, were absolutely instrumental in making that happen. It was also great to see Salmon School celebrated in the Scottish Parliament through a motion which raised further awareness of the wild salmon crisis amongst decision makers. And that's a really important part of our work. And in the lead up to COP26, the Atlantic Salmon Trust supported the Clyde River Foundation in delivering a unique education project to 26 primary schools in the River Clyde catchment. As you'll be aware, salmon were lost from the Clyde during the Industrial Revolution. But in recent decades, the river has been cleaned up and salmon have returned, a real success story that shows us what is possible if we create the right conditions for salmon, free access to cold, clean water. And the children from those primary schools took water samples as part of a global citizen science project led by the Smithsonian Institute. And we hope that this will allow the next generation of salmon advocates to learn about the range of species living in their local rivers, including our wild Atlantic salmon. But it's important to emphasise that the wild salmon crisis doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of the wider climate and biodiversity emergency. And with that in mind, Fisheries Management Scotland are also contributing to the development of the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy, and we think that has real potential to move the situation forward. There's a growing body of evidence now which points to a continuing decline of biodiversity in Scotland, and this needs to be urgently addressed. And we need to recognise the impact of a wide range of current policies on biodiversity and the urgent need to develop more sustainable practices. The status quo is simply not an option. And as far as salmon are concerned, we need to place a greater focus on our rivers and freshwaters and make sure that we provide free access to cold, clean water. But this is obviously not just a problem in Scotland, this is a global problem. And the UN Biodiversity Conference is taking place in China, COP15, later this year. We'll be reviewing the achievements of the Aitchi Biodiversity targets. The delegates there will be reviewing those targets. So we've joined stakeholders from across the world to highlight the loss of freshwater biodiversity and urge delegates at COP15 to take action to protect and restore inland waters, freshwater flows and aquatic habitats. And our colleagues in the Angling Trust, another member of the Missing Salmon Alliance, are working with Wildlife and Countryside Link and have published a report called 10 Species That Can Help Save the World. And one of those species is the Atlantic salmon. And we're collectively calling for urgent leadership across the governments of the UK to restore nature at home and around the world. So what can we do to address these issues? In our film series, which we'll launch this afternoon, you'll see many examples of action to improve the situation for our rivers and the species which inhabit them. One example of this work is Riverwoods. Riverwoods is a Scotland-wide partnership initiative with the objective of creating a network of healthy, resilient rivers and riverbanks across Scotland. As you're probably aware, back in 2018, which was a really hot, dry summer, 2/3 of Scottish rivers experienced temperatures that cause stress for salmon. One of the ways that we can alleviate that stress is by planting native trees next to our rivers, and they can act as natural parasols, helping to alleviate damaging increases in temperature. But they can do so much more than that as well. They can help to mitigate climate change by storing carbon and removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They can help to combat biodiversity loss by providing habitat for wildlife, both above and below the water. And it can help to improve riverbank stability, preventing erosion and helping to manage flood risks. But in order to make that happen, we urgently need the Forestry Grant Scheme and associated agri-environment measures to support and incentivise this vital work. So we really need help to move that forward. So there are lots of things that we can do to help to mitigate the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. But in doing so, we need to ensure that we don't cause further damage. So in the specific case of marine renewables, the Scottish Marine Energy Research Diadromous Fish Specialist Receptor Group, it's a real mouthful, that ScotMer group, has identified and prioritised evidence gaps associated with consenting offshore renewable developments. And we need urgently to ensure that those evidence gaps are filled. You know, we have huge ambitions in Scotland to expand offshore renewables through ScotWind and other mechanisms, but we need to make sure that we identify and answer these key questions before going down that route. Another example is the reintroduction of beavers. Beavers have been reintroduced to Scotland due to their role as ecosystem engineers with a view to creating wetlands and improving water quality. However, the same activities that are responsible for this ecosystem engineering also have the potential to impact on migratory fish and a range of other land users. Beavers are now protected by law in Scotland, and will be allowed to expand their range both naturally and later on this year through translocations within Scotland. We were a part of a group that helped to establish the Beaver management framework, and that allows some of these activities to be managed. And it's long been recognised that these activities do have to be managed in Scotland. And that work's taken place through the Scottish Beaver Forum, of which we're a member. And we're now working on the process to develop a national beaver strategy. And that's the process that must properly manage any translocations that happen within Scotland. So why are we concerned? After all, we regularly hear that beavers are good for fish. Well, many of our concerns relate to beaver activities which are associated with human infrastructure. And I'm just going to give you one example from Tayside here. This is a fish pass on the Shocky Burn, which is near Battleby Loch on the Tay catchment. This is a highly productive salmon tributary. Around about 400 to 700 adult salmon and sea trout have been counted downstream of this fish pass. And there's around 5 miles of productive habitat upstream. And here we have a relatively small beaver dam at the top of the fish pass. And if you look at the bottom right-hand side of the frame, you can see the top of the fish pass there. So what does this beaver dam mean? Well, essentially, it's turned a fish pass which was filled with water into a completely impassable barrier to fish migration. And that's why we take these issues very, very seriously. Staff from the Tay District Salmon Fishery Board have to ensure that that beaver dam is cleared and removed on a weekly basis. And that's not the only site in Tayside where this needs to happen. And that represents currently an unfunded opportunity cost for fisheries managers. And it's really important that this work is properly funded. So what is our focus in relation to beavers? Well, we need to ensure that the beaver management framework takes full account of the needs of migratory fish. We need to ensure that fisheries managers have access to the appropriate management and mitigation tools. And crucially, we need to ensure that beaver management activity undertaken by our members is appropriately resourced, public money for public goods. And we're also working to ensure that no further illegal introductions occur in Scotland. I'm going to move on to fish farming now and start off with regulation. As you'll be aware, for many years now, we've been calling for a fit-for-purpose regulatory regime for fish farming. And over the last year, we've seen some progress. The long-awaited Scottish Government response to the Salmon Interactions Working Group was published last year. And we welcome this, and we now want to see concerted action to deliver these important recommendations, which were unanimously agreed by all of the members of that group. We also haven't lost sight of the report of the REC committee inquiry from the last parliamentary term. SEPA have recently closed the consultation on proposals for a risk-based spatial framework for managing sea lice. And again, we welcome the principles set out in that consultation, but we absolutely emphasise that it must encompass all farms, new and existing, and we need a regulatory system that protects sea trout and salmon, and we'll be working with SEPA to ensure that this happens at pace. And last year, Marine Scotland Science published a report on genetic integration in Scotland. And this important project demonstrated that signs of integration were concentrated in areas of marine aquaculture production and freshwater smolt rearing. Outside these areas, little to no genetic changes were detected. This is an important report, and we're clear that more action is required to eliminate escapes in line with our international commitments and in line with the recommendations of the Salmon Interactions Working Group. So we've also been working with our partners on the West Coast Tracking Project, which is a partnership project designed to help protect wild salmon. And that project is managed by ourselves, the Atlantic Salmon Trust, and by Marine Scotland. And the delivery of this fantastic project is coordinated by AST and supported by the University of Glasgow and fisheries boards and trusts across the west coast of Scotland. And this project could not proceed without their significant input and expertise. But we're also really grateful for quite considerable funding that's come in from the Scottish Government, from private donations, and also from Salmon Scotland. And this is a really positive step forward. And just to make you aware that some of the preliminary results from year one are now available, including an animation which summarises the results. And you can see that from our website, and the link is in the presentation here. This important information about wild salmon migration patterns will contribute to our understanding of and ability to manage interactions with marine developments. It will also help to inform the sea lice risk assessment framework being developed by SEPA. And through Charlotte, our aquaculture interactions manager, we continue to support members in engaging with the industry on a range of issues, including environmental management plans and monitoring for sea lice. And we're also engaging closely with planners and other statutory consultees on planning casework, both in the freshwater environment and the marine environment. And we're extremely grateful to Marine Scotland and Crown Estate Scotland for supporting this important work. And on a further positive note, applications have just closed for the second round of the Wild Salmon Support Fund. And this fund, which is managed by Foundation Scotland, was established to prioritise investment by the Scottish salmon farming sector for the benefit of wild salmon and sea trout populations in Scottish rivers. We welcome this investment through a process that respects our independence with regard to policy, planning processes and future operational matters. And this is a principle that we'll be looking to replicate with other sectors on the basis that those who benefit from the use of the natural environment should contribute to its ongoing management. So I'm going to move on now to river basin management plans and the delivery of the Water Framework Directive. And as you'll be aware, the third river basin management plan is now live. It was published earlier this year, or late last year. And the River Basin Management Plan includes a range of challenging and ambitious targets to be met by 2027 across a range of issues, including water supply and wastewater, sustainable and resilient rural land use and management, removing man-made barriers to fish migration, and in a range of other actions, including actions on hydroelectric development, on distilling, on aquaculture, on invasive non-native species, and addressing acidification. But we've gone a long way down this road. A large proportion of our water bodies in Scotland are already at good or better status. So that slightly raises the question, will meeting Water Framework Directive targets actually be enough to address the salmon crisis and indeed the wider biodiversity crisis? And that is an open question at the moment. We're really keen to explore that further. So I'm going to focus in on two of the key areas for us, and that's water scarcity and fish passage. And as you'll be aware, warm, dry summers are predicted to be more common in future, and indeed they're happening now. Last year was another warm, dry summer, and in 2018 we had real issues in terms of water temperatures and water scarcity. SEPA consulted on a water resources management plan in December 2020, but that really hasn't progressed anything like as quickly as we would like to see, and we want to see that progress quickly. The River Basin Management Plan includes a commitment for SEPA to review the licenses for 34 hydropower schemes to deliver improvements in flows and levels in fish passage. And again, we want to see that work taken forward quickly. There's also an incredibly ambitious target to remove or ease 244 impassable man-made barriers across Scotland. And SEPA, through the Water Environment Fund team, will be working really hard to make sure that that happens. And I just want to put that target in some sort of context, because since the publication of the second River Basin Management Plan, 29 barriers to fish migration were removed or eased. So this is a massive scaling up of that task. We're working with SEPA to identify and make progress in a range of priority areas, including some of the areas on this slide, but also to work through the licensing system to ensure that it's meeting the needs of wild fish and wild fisheries managers. So I just want to leave you with a thought, and the thought is, it really is, in our view, time for a reset. And we really need to take action on two main fronts. There's lots of work going on to protect and restore wild salmon, and I've given you a tiny flavour of that during this presentation, and you'll hear a lot more about that this afternoon. But we also need to work to ensure that other activities, often under the regulatory control of other bodies or supported with public funding, do not compromise these efforts to address the wild salmon and biodiversity crises. And with that in mind, we need our regulators to regulate effectively and place a much stronger focus on compliance and enforcement. In other words, we need regulators to deliver on their key role, and we feel that that hasn't maybe happened over the last few years as much as it could. So I hope I've given you at least a sense of some of our activities over the past year. There are a number of issues that I haven't covered, such as predation, our work on predation, and the pink salmon invasion that we had last year. But you hear much more about the range of issues we're working to address this afternoon when we launch our film. Thank you very much indeed.